Don't deploy on Friday. So you might all know that phrase, right? As a developer, we are often afraid to deploy on Friday. But why is that actually the case? And we need to think about that for a moment, because not being able to make a deploy on Friday or any other day is actually some form of defect in your team. Yes, okay, that might be a little bit provocative, right? But what is it in that moment? And that is clearly the lack of confidence. And lack of confidence is just a symptom of a more deeper rooted cause. And we need to take a look for that cause. Oftentimes when we think about deploying software, we are afraid of that we break things. We are afraid of that we actually don't know what we deploy there, because there are so many changes from so many colleagues that we actually, maybe we need to get a meeting before we actually deploy those things and those kind of problems. And of course, being afraid to crash things, to break builds, to have complaining customers, to have complaining superiors. So that is bad. But in my opinion, and that is how I used to work for the last 15 years, is you should be able to deploy to every time you actually need to deploy. May it be fixes, may it be features, it doesn't matter. And that is all based on good practices. And those good practices will help you to prevent this defect. And the most known way to do that is actually continuous delivery. And today I want to talk about continuous delivery in small tech and startups, because it is actually a very powerful thing in that small business area. So why is that? Starting with continuous delivery, to integrate, test, and deploy very often, basically daily, and get that stuff out to the client, to the customers, and get some feedback about that to build upon that. It is basically the opposite of something like GitFlow, where we basically hide our things inside long-lived branches, separated features, and on some point in time, we try to merge that to a feature and deploy that, and we handle fixes and other small changes separately. That is a very complex thing and totally unnecessary. I personally totally dislike that kind of work. And when we are going to mentor people, when we're going to support other companies, that is very often the root cause of many problems out there without the people noticing. Because people think, hey, GitFlow is actually a great idea. We can make sure that everything is working before we deploy. But is it actually the case? Because you deploy so many things at the same time, so many things which weren't in the same branch for quite a long time, that you have a lot of potential conflicts you might not see while deploy. And that is something you basically eliminate by having small batches in continuous delivery. And the idea of continuous delivery is that you only have one trunk. So the trunk is where every developer is pushing and pulling towards to, right? That is what you actually do. So you basically start to work, you pull the latest changes, you make your commits, you push, and you pull again, so that you are extremely close to everyone else. That is, of course, something where you then need to have some form of practices and methods in place to make that work. And how is that actually going to improve the confidence then? Because, well, if I just push and pull my latest changes, well, they are broken code right now. So how can I push them? We need to be always in a committable state as soon as we start to commit. That is extremely important. If we, for example, create a new feature or change a specific component, so we need to make sure that our changes are small. We're talking about small batch sizes here, which means that everything we do should not affect too many things and in a too broad way. We basically can oversee in that very moment that things might break or not. Instead of removing a component right now, we can basically run the same component in parallel and get some technical feedback under specific circumstances, how this is actually working before we releasing it, which sometimes is called shadow deployments as well. The same can be done with feature flags, but I would recommend to not overdo it with feature flags. Try to avoid them as long as possible, because you need to clean them up at some point in time. But I would always prefer to run feature flags over separated branches, separated long-lived branches. Another thing is to know that when we actually deploy things, they will work, which means small batch sizes is the very minimum, the bare minimum, of course, but we need to make sure that the stuff we do is actually working. So in very small startups, when you just start. I know that many people pretend and say that we don't need to test things at all. Others are very hesitant or just have end-to-end tests in place. In my opinion, we should have at least a very core essential test covered, and the best way to do that, in my opinion, what I would recommend is TDD, so test-driven development. And test-driven development is actually an extremely good fit for continuous delivery as well, to build up confidence, design a better system, or basically you do it naturally if you write your tests up front, and make sure that every piece and bit you actually commit and push to trunk is tested before you do that in a way that is actually not breaking things. And that is a very important aspect when you want to become confident. So confidence, to wrap it up, confidence is based on several factors, not only those I just mentioned, but those are very prominent ones. So you need to make sure that you can deploy on Fridays and to any time when you need to deploy things, because the distance between the changes of yourself and your colleagues is basically very small and the batch sizes are small, which means that you as a sole developer can oversee what you deploy in that very moment. And that is important because on the other hand, you have sometimes extremely large deployments where people basically mushing together a lot of branches on a day, make some form of weirdo review because, the larger the pull requests become, the more likely it is that people just passing things through because it's way too much work and overhead to go through all the things again. And that is one of the points why we become less confident as well, because we all know about that sometimes we are just overwhelmed and can't really foresee the consequences of things when we deploy such a large chunk or mess in that moment. Often, most of the time, it's a mess, right? And the smaller you become, the less likely is that you break something. For example, you just make a change in the front end of a headline, just push it out. You don't even need to have a code review in that moment, just push it out. And if you have a new feature and you need to push it out on the same day, just grab a colleague. This is another thing I recommend, is to have synchronized code reviews, and only if you really need them. And if you need them is actually something you as a software engineer should be able to determine. So if you can't determine if your code will break something or not, you shouldn't deploy at all. And that is something you need to learn very early on and become a mature person others can rely on. So a code review is more for getting feedback. It's not for getting permission to deploy something. That might be different in regulated environments, but especially in small companies and startups, that should be treated in a more mature way and make sure that you actually understand what you do. And that adds to confidence as well. Over time, when you do those things, it will be that your team will become not even more confident, but more of a team, because you share the ways you work more closely together. So your work is not hidden away. Sometimes people work in the very same components, functions, or classes on the same day by pushing and pulling together. So you work more as a soccer or football team together in the very moment as to play this asynchronous game and sometimes have those overlaps and merges with your other colleagues. So it makes a better team out of yourself if you are able to deploy daily. Personally, we work on code bases which are roughly between 100,000 and 150,000 lines of code, right? And those are most likely for mid-sized to large enterprises in the European area. And those kind of applications work very well with continuous delivery. And I have to say, we have so much better results than other companies working with long-lived branches, GitFlows, complicated review processes, a lot of strange QA testing things which are abstract and after development. Those kind of things don't actually work as well as continuous delivery. I was personally using continuous delivery without knowing that it is called like that for many years before, even when we used SVN or Subversion back in the days. And we tend to use trunk-based development because it was a horror to branch with Subversion. And we wanted to get our changes as fast as possible to the business people, to the people who actually provide us some feedback about the changes. And now I want to dive into something extremely interesting and important as well. It is that continuous delivery is actually improving the business factor and is reducing the burnout rate. So the best example which is coming to my mind every time is this feature of 3 weeks of work, and we basically hide that in some feature branch. We work on that. We are, very confident that we can do that in the beginning, and in the middle we already see that maybe we run out of time and we will, we need to do more or something like that. And short before we actually want to deliver, it is either not in the quality because we rushed, or we need more time. In both cases, the people who were relying on us that we actually get this thing done in time and quality are actually a little bit disappointed. And that is when you basically stack that up over time, leads to some form of stress, then to severe stress, and on some point in time it can lead to burnout. Because the confidence between business and development is basically declining. You create a gap, and that's a disconnect between those both worlds, and you should avoid that at all costs. And on the other hand, if you do that with continuous delivery and you basically report every day your progress made in which form ever, right? Then after the first week already, the business people already know about that you will be late. And that is very transparent, that is very openly, and the people can do something about that. They can move appointments, they can move marketing, they can adapt, they can do something about the budget or make sure that it's actually working. So you make that in that moment, you make that a problem of the company, which it is, right? It is not a problem solely of you developers. You are not magicians who are supposed to do impossible things. So never ever try to do the impossible, because it's impossible. Impossible. Try to do something predictive and deterministic. We are software developers. We should aim for determinism. And that is the best way you can do, is to get feedback as soon as possible in the process. And that is by asking the people, hey, we have done now a week of work. Can you provide us already some feedback? We will make a short meeting, or just send them a link or something like that to that environment, to specific rights, so that they can review the current changes, and you will get some feedback. Maybe they come to the conclusion, or you as a company, as a team or whatever, that you need to change something, that it might have not been the best way to think about that problem in the beginning, and then you can change things on the go without waiting until this sprint is done, which is, in my opinion, way closer to the original idea of agile, as many agile methodologies are, which aren't agile. That is actually, in the very same moment, removing the pressure of estimations a bit, and makes estimations again, and not commitments of development teams which you need to uphold over a specific amount of time, which is often impossible. So we need to be realistic about our work, and we need to create quality output. Continuous delivery is by far the best method to do that, because you actually work as a team inside your development and outside of development, right? To understand that you need to bridge the gap between development and business stakeholders, or QA or POs or whoever is on the other side. So don't treat the development as some kind of internal bubble, which is often done by outsourcing work to other companies. Something I really don't like, because it is exactly causing that kind of problems. And if you do that, try to implement continuous delivery in those spaces as well. It will make a night and day difference. Believe me, it is so often the case that we actually save companies because they had this disconnect between those both worlds and were basically not trusting each other anymore, and those kind of very bad things happen, and basically distracting you from the actual things you want to do, which is providing value and features. By the way, providing value inside startups is not an overused term. It is the very essential thing you need to focus on in order to survive, pay your bills, pay your salaries, and all these kind of things. When you have enough runway, when you have enough budget, you can actually focus better on development, which is better for us developers as well, because we are less stressed about what we do, And in the end, we can focus on things like continuous delivery, where we then can become more confident in what we do. And finally, we would be able to deploy on Friday, because why not? It is the same thing as we would deploy the small changes on Monday. So we actually know what happens. We can make a quick test and it's all fine. We can do. We don't need to, but it is always good to do so, because what's done is done. And that is one of the most fundamental things as a human being in any form of work. Get your things done and go to the next one. Don't stack up things. Don't have the feeling that, oh, we need to make this deployment on Monday then, because how great is that if you go into the weekend and you're thinking about the changes you need to make on Monday because you weren't confident and brave enough to do that on Friday? That is not good either. It shouldn't be. Or actually, it should feel bad in that moment. Okay, I hope that helped you a little bit to understand why continuous delivery is my favorite way of developing things as a business, as a development person, and why CD is such an important practice for smaller companies to stay in motion, to be confident, to develop maturity and all those kind of things, to be able to focus on features and value instead of struggling with, how can we deploy this? I don't know. And, staying in this cycle of fixes and bug fixes and bug fixes because of problems you caused over time and they weren't really addressed because they were hidden for weeks in branches and all those kind of things. Get your things done. Stay in one single source of truth, which is your trunk, and become one team doing great things. I hope that helped. I wish you a great time. See you next time.